twin transition. And it's not about games, it's about digitalization and green transition or climate change. And how do we actually fit digitalization into this, this problem that is kind of unsolvable or very difficult to think about how to solve. And I try to explore the origins of it, the idea of it, and especially since my background is in anthropology, and as an undergraduate, I was really trained in kinship. I mean, that's how you trained anthropologists in the old days. You had to have, is it better? Yes, sorry. Sorry? Okay. That's another way to do it. Move the, move the thing, thank you. So being trained in understanding kinship, every time I see a kinship term, I really get like, what does that actually mean? What kind of kinship idea is behind this? And when it's used metaphorically in policy, I get even more interested to try to pick it apart and is it my understanding that what kinship is, or is it something else underneath? So I'm trying to do that and see what is it this policy is trying to do, and how is it trying to think about climate change, but also how is it thinking about digitalization and the relation between them. So I have to use this. Yeah? There we go. Of course, I shouldn't point it this way, I should point it that way. Sorry. So my background says is in anthropology. I've been a professor since 2020 and head of the Climate IT Center. It's just for background, I've done research, ethnographic research in Papua New Guinea for several years, in Bangladesh and Brazil, and a little bit in Denmark. So I try to see these problems of how technology and ideas of technology and climate change are interrelated in many different contexts. And the research we're doing here is part of a bigger project funded by the European Research Council, Decoupling IT, which is about how we try to think about this interrelation between digitalization and climate change, or technology and climate change, and how technology is seen as a magic trick in a way sometimes that can get in and hopefully enact a saving of resources. And for those of you who are not familiar with the discussion of decoupling, it's very much an economic discussion of how we can think about continue economic growth and fund our welfare and all that, but diminish or reduce the resource use. And there are many sort of variations of decoupling that I'm not going through, but it's simply the idea that we can actually keep economic growth, but we will not affect the climate in that way. And the role of digital technologies in that is what I'm really curious about. How do you integrate that? So for a background, it is a bigger discussion of what role digital technologies can play. And just about 10 years ago, you could see very different projections of that. The report over here is from the GACI 2030 report, authored by Accenture and other telecommunication companies. And they claim that for every sort of ton of carbon dioxide emitted through investments in digitalization, you would save 10 tons of climate or carbon dioxide elsewhere, simply by being more efficient, by optimizing resource use, by being, all that sort of usual story of why do we even have IT and digitalization in the first place. Same year, a Swedish researcher from Huawei, Anders Andre, published another projection presenting 3 different scenarios of electricity use in telecommunication technologies. And the worst case scenario is 50% of our electricity use will go to digital technologies in 2030, right? So saving 10 times of what we invest versus actually spending half of our resources. Of course, you can easily pick apart sort of the intentions and the author's interest in this. I mean, one thing is industry and only presenting one very nice scenario, not presenting any other scenarios. The other one being trying to be a little more constructive and different scenarios. So of course it sort of shows the variations of how you position, but it also shows we don't even know actually what we are counting or comparing, I think. One thing is about, we can compare electricity of industries and technologies, but you can compare what that electricity spend does elsewhere. And it's very, very difficult to compare many of these projections in the first place. But it shows something about the need, at least, to actually engage in discussions of why do we digitalize? What is it for? What are the effects of it? Is it even, and how do we actually think about doing something about climate change? So, yeah, so getting to twin transition. I became really kind of curious about this term when I was part of working groups on different Danish government agencies. And my interlocutors in the public sector, but also in private sector digitalization, they kind of really believed in the first graph I just showed you, the first image, right? I mean, that of course it's good to digitalize. I mean, of course we save resources. We can see that on our accounts and our budgets. But I also got the impression when you're kind of engaging with them in discussions and trying to give other arguments and say, well, I mean, yes, AI is good for us in this way, but those doing illegal logging in Amazon are also using AI to get better access to resources that you find, of course, oil wells more easily, you extract them much more efficiently, you actually don't get us weaned off fossil fuels if we use AI in the petroleum sector. So it's very difficult to get to assess, you know, what is you're assessing when you're saying it's better for us. And I got the impression that many of my interlocutors really felt it was a belief. It had to be right. It had to work. And that sort of being wedded to the idea of twin transition as a solution is what I really thought was interesting. I mean, I'm not saying it was like a denial or anything, but trying to understand what did they put into it? What kind of work did it do for them to believe and to pursue twin transition? And of course, I got sort of, if you Google the term and you find images, you'll find something like this fairly easily, like all this magic fairy dust around some nice images, and it appears very magic, right? Very easy if we talk about it this way. So it's really an example of this nice and promissory and optimistic perspective where we cannot fail, right? We have something to work with us to help us. But if you go sort of to the concept itself and see where does it come from? What does it mean? As I mentioned, it originally came out of the European Green Deal, the 2020 Commission work program of the EU. And I think the first sort of mention I've found was Ursula von der Leyen speaking to the European Parliament in Strasbourg in 2019, where she listed some of the challenges and priorities of her commission. And climate change and digitalization were set separately first, but then she went on to state we should harness this transformative power of the twin digital and climate transition to strengthen our own industrial base and innovation potential. So trying to put into the term all the things that industrial growth and so on really would like to have. But so the performing rhetorically what is a good speech for a politician, of course. It's been then taken up in many other places by the World Economic Forum. This is coming out. Sorry, I'm not sure if you can read all of them up there. I didn't know the room was going to be like this, or the screen was like that. But the Davos elites took it up as a sort of untapped opportunity that was really huge and really fantastic for all of us. The original formulations also played a lot on just transition from the legacy of the Paris Agreement and how just transition had to be integrated with digitalization. There was, of course, a lot of unclarity. It's quite vague at this point in time. I mean, is it about two different processes that are parallel? Or is it about the synergies that they create? How much you have to do to integrate them, or does it happen automatically? It's very much like, in the beginning, this wish for kind of presentation that what we should do or what should happen. Of course, there's an EU policy flavor to it. Twinning is not the first sort of twinning we've seen at EU policy level. I mean, many large organizations, of course, have that, and the World Bank have typically a triple win thing when they present policies. So I guess it's sort of the specific flavor of this specific organization as well. It's also grown to encompass other interesting concepts like digitainability, digital sustainability. There's also green transition, green transformation used interchangeably, decarbonization, and many sort of overall discussions, they're used interchangeably. It doesn't really matter which one you use. But going back, it's kind of interesting when you then trace sort of the idea behind it, and it, in a sense, is not really new. The relation between digitalization and ecological transition, resource management, has, at least since the 90s, come up again and again with reference to information society, the cloud, etc. Is immateriality and lack of impact of having digital technologies. I mean, and those of you who are my age, you'll probably remember the first emails we saw with there was this bottom line that said, "Don't print this email," because people did print emails, right? And so all the stories of how much paper we could save didn't really come through. And finding you can still find companies that try to promise the paperless office out there. So clearly, 30 years on, it hasn't changed. Some reduction, but not really enough. So it's actually a longer narrative of how the digital and ecological impact intersects. But as an anthropologist, I'm curious about what does the twinning then mean? I mean, what kind of twins are being imagined or talked about? And how is it, again, how is this relationship really twin-like? I mean, and I guess I'm not the only one who thinks that, well, twins are usually the same. I mean, they don't have to be identical twins, but at least they have the same origin, right? They have sort of the same DNA in many ways, mostly. But when you started reading the policy papers, you find out that maybe that's actually not what they present. First, like a Norwegian computer scientist writes, the term twin transition stems from the work with the European Green Deal and understanding that the two transitions are everywhere and for everyone. They're umbilically linked, like that's actually a quote here, even if they also have their own individual dynamics and trajectories. And then he states, the umbilical connectivity between the two transitions cannot be postulated. It must be established and translated into action. So in a way, it's like the twins need to be twin, right? You need to actually do something to actually make the twins twin-like. So kind of in a way, now I'm just doing sort of this deconstruction of the term, which is fairly easy. And I'm kind of continue deconstructing a little bit before we try to say, how can we then think more creatively about, what does the term do? This is another image that you find fairly easily, sort of creating this win-win, creating the twinning, finding this what's called the sweet spot in many of these reports. It mentions the greening of and by IT and data, as it's a mutual exchange, a dialectic between two different processes. It talks about amplification, that is, one does something to the other, one supports the other, makes the other better, bigger. It's very much optimistic and anticipatory, many of these stories, of course, and kind of get the impression, though, that if these are twins, they're only twin-like in one little area in between, maybe not overall. When you then start to talk to the people who promote it and how they sort of find justifications for it, a lot of them focus on projects. They scale it down to their own organization, to their own specifically limited and bounded ways of working. There's like the Twin Transition Playbook by a company that was published a few years ago. There's have been pilot projects in Estonia. That's the Twinnovation up there is an example of that, where actors who engaged with it said that the project completely shifted their focus. It made them think much more about environmental impact of activities. They were already paying attention to innovation and sustainability, but after the project, they expected to have much deeper understanding of environmental protection and technological innovations and how those were interrelated. So you could find synergy in practice, so to speak, and at a sort of lower local concrete levels of companies or organizations working. So synergies, yes, you could find that. I'm going to skip this. This is my own sort of real empirical material. It's not helpful in this presentation. And I'm probably also going to go over time otherwise. But confusion is the other thing you might find. And many of the first research papers publishing about the policy would highlight this confusion. Is it policy revolution or just jargon? Is it high-level policy or science fiction? Is it decent, inclusive, and green? Mission Impossible. So those sort of highlighting these problems would also highlight, of course, there's a huge inequality within the European Union of what resources do you have to actually carry this out? What companies and what governments would actually emphasize and prioritize this? So lots of problems with synergy at national and international or supranational levels. Different sectors with very different interests, and many premises had to be in place when you start to actually dig it out. So just to summarize sort of the existing literature on the term, a lot of them focus on trade-offs. The trade-off of spending electricity on AI is really acknowledged by everyone, but some think it will be offset by everything that AI will help us save. Then the question emerges, can it also protect labor? Can it create equality jobs for those affected? Can digital expansion be kept in check? Can we control it? A lot of people argue for more research into it, but actually we don't know necessarily what this policy will do, what kind of effects will it have, how will it be implemented. There's the time scale. Is this just a temporary stepping stone or a permanent solution that we're trying to pursue? The spatial differences, EU focused, uneven capacity. What if we outsource everything to non-EU countries, which is of course a well-known story. How effective is it actually as a policy? A policy, of course, can be strategic. It's something you aim towards. It doesn't necessarily have to be concretely laid out everywhere. It gives people resources to think. In that sense, it might have worked for some of the companies I mentioned before, the Estonians, for example. But does it actually do that? The transformations, are they happening in some places, not in others? Are they bounded transformations when climate change is global? Is it actually enough? And I think one of the bigger challenges, I think, is when you think that these can be combined, you kind of assume that the green transition is already a technological transition. It's not about degrowth. It's not about the narrative that we have to be more humble with our resource use, because then digitalization will not save us, right? But if we can and believe that technologies will help us, then of course it makes sense to have it as a think about twin transition. So that's really the basic assumption, I think, behind many of the disagreements. So when I should then contrast these transitions, I want to ask, what is the objective of each process? And one is clear, digitalization is about growth. It's about maybe reducing extractive growth, but it is about growing. And green growth, some people have a problem with that. And again, depending on where you are in relation to what is a green transition, it's not necessarily the same objective as digitalization. At least I cannot imagine Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or Musk or anyone, Peter Thiel, even believing that growth should not happen or that these are necessarily the same. And so the driving forces behind these are probably different as well. One is more driven by private sector competition and growth. The other largely driven by governments, at least. In Denmark, I think there's investments in green transition from a lot of governments or interests, in the private sector, there are lots of initiatives, but it's not the same everywhere. At least that's also some of the foundings of earlier literature on this. And if you do sort of it's a very difficult calculation again, but if you try to figure out what assumptions about a problem are actually underneath and how many resources do you invest in each of these, about the speeds by which it happened, about how ownership and distribution of these processes are, then there's also a lot of differences. I made a very unscientific investigation through a certain generative AI thing and asked it how much it invested in digitalization globally per year and how much it invested in green transition technologies per year. And the difference was like 3 to 1. And you can guess yourself where the most money goes. And it's probably, even now, it's probably much more skewed relationship. So I think that in itself also says that it's green twin transition. It's a little bit of what I'll get to, a little bit of a fantasy more than maybe something that's realistic, realistically happen. I mean, at least these are happening at very different speeds and very different forms of very driven in very different ways. So of course the question is still, can they be merged? Can they go together? But yeah, it's very doubtful. So anyway, it's very easy to deconstruct. Sorry, those are all the things I want to show. Very easy to deconstruct transition, and so I'll draw a little bit upon some of the science technology studies literature and anthropology literature and economic sociology that has delved into sort of how does policy work? How do we actually create, or what do statements about the world actually do? For example, Michel Calong and Donald Mackenzie argue that economics as a discipline not merely studies the economy as activities, it performs and shapes it, right? All the calculations, the modelings, the devices that create ideas of what the economy is, it's actually, again, giving us a sense of there is something called the economy. This is inspired on one hand by Austinian speech act theories, but also the sociology of Barry Barnes, where this reference to the economy of devices and graphs and calculative agencies really is what brings it into being. So it's not a constitutive statement about something that is, it's a performative statement, but something you do, right? Something that will happen or is happening. So you could say twin transition, is that the same, right? Are these speeches and guidelines and all that, do they perform the processes as twins? I mean, is it enough? Can you actually create this twinning by talking about it in this way? And again, this is sort of a deconstructing of it, deconstructing the mechanisms that try to bring it into being. And at the same time, it kind of takes the statement seriously. And that's sort of where I get to more the anthropology inspiration. How can we, it's again a discussion in anthropology, how can we take statements about an existing and desirable world seriously? I mean, is it a twin transition? What do we actually try to take, just step back and accept it is actually twinning? Then what kind of twins is it? And this is where I use a metaphor or analogy of my own from a very old classic anthropology discussion that found among the Nuer of southern Sudan, where they had so in their worldview that twins and birds were the same. Twins are birds. It's not just metaphorically speaking, it was in their worldview that since both twins and birds, or birds were already related to the gods, to the upper, higher, the sky, and birds would nurture several offspring. And if twins also were several offspring of the same mother, then they were also magical. They were also spiritually endowed. But of course, you had anthropology saying, well, do they really think twins are birds because ones are humans, some are birds? I mean, are they really the same? How should we take such a statement seriously about people's experience of the world or what we say about the world when we, as researchers, kind of step back and say, well, do you really mean that, right? And lots of huge debates about who's actually being sort of more primitive logic, because earlier anthropologists would say, well, they're primitive, they don't understand the world at all, if they think this is the case. And later anthropologists saying, well, maybe, of course, they understand that a human and a bird is not the same, but that's not the point. The point is trying to understand underneath what is it that makes these into equal beings or the same kind of beings, this form of the immanence of the divine in these beings. Anyway, a longer discussion that I'm not going to bore you more with, but it's to show that once you talk about specific forms of relatedness, which twins are, then you kind of also assume something with your own cultural background, but other backgrounds might have very different ideas of it. And it kind of, I think, helps me at least ask what is, again, in a statement of saying something is twin-like. Is there an intention to it? Is it ideology? Or is it really an immanence of two processes? So this is where I get sort of again to the deconstruction of, of this. And if we don't just say it as a performative statement or action, but as ideology, but not necessarily false or something that doesn't exist, then given that it, what is the response? And sort of my curiosity with my interlocutors in the public sector in Denmark, that they kind of believe in this. Even you could deconstruct it for them, but they would still pursue this. And I guess Slavoj Žižek, that some of you whose work some of you might know, has maybe an idea for how we can talk about this. That ideology is still powerful even if deconstructed. And my reading of Žižek is admittedly through someone else, through an anthropologist named Navari Yashin, who discusses how the Turkish state can exist. It's to her, she kind of analyzes the Turkish state as something already deconstructed. Everybody knows that there's no state. This is just power. This is people who are corrupt and use their networks, and there is all these laws and the rules are just for, they're just statements and doesn't reflect the real sort of affair of things, of what the state claims to be. But everyone knows it's deconstructed. So it's more about understanding this desire for something to be a state, sort of the fantasies. The state is an ideology that we desire. It's not to reduce it to psychology necessarily, but to relate structural processes, whether it's the state or capitalism or digitalization, to actual practices of individuals or subjects that pursue these. And of course it blurs, a lot of intermediation and subjectivity and all that, but the point is we kind of explain with Žižek how the political survives and endures despite this being deconstructed, how sort of ideas of twin transition exist still despite maybe not actually working out if you actually dive into it. Right. And I mean, and this is sort of one way of thinking about it. It's, in a way, if I should then think more about, you actually, other people are trying to use Žižek to understand different forms of green transition. For example, carbon markets, and a scholar named Robert Watts studied the psychoanalytical ideology critique of carbon markets and how people trading in offsets would sort of have this automatic disavow and say, well, actually, I know that offsets don't really work, but we still work with them. And he tries to explain it through sort of the disavowal itself is actually what keeps performing it, keeps it on. And this sort of idea that the fantasy here, the desire, can actually enable subjects to account for the failures already in advance, right? So disavowal and cynical distance is part of, again, back to the performance of it. Of course, this is a little bit different from what I experienced. I mean, people wouldn't disavow it and then still pursue it. They would certainly keep claiming it was there. And finding, of course, then just the consolation in specific cases of it. So trying to round off and getting back to the idea of the sweet spot. There's so on one hand, performativity. There's a representational relation here between that which is said as statement, that which is statement says something about. Here, while it could be intended as a performance, bringing the twins into being as twins by stating them to be twins, then maybe the reality resists, right? Maybe it's just not that easy. And on the other hand, we can sort of critique this ideology as a fantasy and say what motivates people to pursue it and how do they reason about it. It's really the important thing, not so much whether it exists or not, but the whole thing as political and ideological about power and subject positions, that's really what we should focus on. And of course, there's lots of problems you could still dive into, and to many of the current visions for twin transition there's all the parts of digitalization that is not covered. There are lots of parts that counters digitalization's accelerating forces maybe. And I still kind of see if these are two different processes, I would kind of see them, well, they're not totally overlapping for sure. I mean, there are parts of them might overlap, but there's parts that really draw in different directions. So, and I'm going to do a counter metaphor again of this reading. I mean, it's not you can't do a twinning, right? I mean, to me, it's just logically impossible, right? Either you're twins or you're not from birth. And of course, there could be other kinship systems where you can become twins, but not in my kinship system. So to me, it's as if somebody's trying to marry part digitalization and part green transition, and then ignore that there's much more to these processes. So it's more like a part-whole relationship that doesn't work for twins. You can't be part twin, right? Unless the aim is to bring everything outside into this overlap, right? So how I make sense of this is, say, maybe it's a better analogy. It's a marriage of convenience, right? We have digitalization, we cannot stop it. We need to green it. We need green transition. And maybe we can use digitalization in some ways to make it better, not solve it, but at least interject and get some better understandings of various ways of spending resources. So I don't think twin transition term makes sense. Of course, it's not up to me to decide, but as a marriage of convenience, maybe we can talk about it. And they're uneven partners. They're different resources. They bring different things into this marriage. There's really this ongoing digital transition of society. Maybe it can and must contribute, but the digital transition must also become greener. But I mean, maybe I should have forced marriage. I don't know. That could be another way of saying it. But marriages are problematic. We have arguments with your partners. You don't have to be the same. You don't have to be alike, but you agree that the kids should grow up and our Earth should continue existing. So I think that's sort of the more hopeful endpoint I can end with. That there are opportunities and chances, but we shouldn't talk about these as twins. I think we should talk about this as a marriage that we need to work towards. So I'm going to end there, and I hope somebody have questions or comments on this. Thanks.